Hey, everybody, welcome to our Breakpoint Forum, the real facts about gender ideology. I'm John Stonestreet, the president of the Colson Center. So great to have so many of you. Had over 3,000 folks sign up to either be here with us live or to get the recording of this. And it just testifies to how significant this topic actually is. And it's also a topic that's not just out there. A lot of these topics we think of as happening in Hollywood or in DC, kind of on the coast, but this is something that affects so many of us on a personal level, myself and my family included. And so it's so helpful to be talking about this with such renowned experts. I'm going to introduce our two presenters for this Breakpoint Forum here in just a second. I want to just hit a couple housekeeping items. The most important being is this is interactive. So each of our presenters are going to speak for just really about 15 or so minutes on a specific area having to do with some kind of lead questions that we've provided for them. And other than that, we're going to be taking questions. So we want you to go ahead and submit your questions at any time. And you can see there on the screen how to do that. You can text in your question there, 844-872-1088. And some questions are already coming in. We're going to do our best to get to as many of them as possible, as much as time would allow. And so we're going to get right to it here just as quickly as possible. A lot of times we talk about at the Colson Center how quickly culture can change, and that's really a feature of our modern society. I often talk about how quickly things that were unthinkable yesterday are unquestionable today. And obviously, the gender idea, this question that has been posed really in recent years, can someone actually be born into the wrong body, especially when it comes to children? Is that even the case? I mean, this wasn't a question that dominated really any cultural moment until ours just recently. I spent a lot of time even in January here looking back just a year ago and thinking of how just kind of, inevitable the kind of the gender revolution seemed across all aspects of society. It just seemed almost unstoppable in so many ways. And here we are at the beginning of 2024. And what's happened in the last year is that there's some real cracks in this revolution, praise God. And some of those cracks have to do with the work of our guests, our experts this evening for our forum, just getting the medical facts out. So many bad ideas go through in our society under this kind of idea of like, oh yeah, the kids will be fine and the science is settled. And what we've seen over the last year are real indications, first of all, that the kids aren't fine and the science is anything but settled. So without further ado, I want to bring on our experts and give them a chance each to present. Now, we're going to hear first from Dr. Miriam Grossman. I'm going to introduce her in just a second. Here she is. And Dr. Grossman is board certified in psychiatry and the subspecialty of child and adolescent psychiatry. She's the author of Lost in Trans Nation. This was just really a best-selling, groundbreaking book over the past year, really documenting just the medical malpractice that's happened really wide and far around this issue. Dr. Grossman's practice focuses on gender-distressed young people and their parents. She believes that every child is born in the right body. So Dr. Grossman, I'm going to give you a chance to speak in just a second. I just want to say hello and thank you so much for being here. Before I ask you your kind of leading question, I do want to just acknowledge and introduce here our second panelist, Dr. Stephen Grcevich. There's Dr. Grcevich right there. He is a child and adolescent psychiatrist as well. He serves as president and founder of Key Ministry. His book from 2018, Mental Health in the Church, presents a strategy for evangelism and outreach with individuals and families impacted by mental illness. And he spent a lot of time talking about this particular issue having to do with the other comorbidities of mental illness. So, Dr. Grcevich, thank you for being with us. We're going to let you fade into the background for just a second here and let Dr. Grossman begin our evening. First of all, Dr. Grossman, I want to say thank you for this book, Lost in Trans Nation. When it came out and I saw what it was about and the depth and the breadth of all the things that it covered, I thought this is an overdue book. There it is. There he goes. And look at that subtitle, A Child Psychiatrist's Guide Out of the Madness. That kind of basically telegraphs the and Dr. Jordan Peterson wrote the foreword to that.
Yeah.
That subtitle really kind of, I think, telegraphs a little bit of an answer to this question. But I really want you to answer this question as a way of getting us started. Why did you feel so compelled to write this book? And what's the gist of the main message, especially for parents?
Well, John, thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you for inviting me on. I'm very happy to be here and talking to you and your audience. I wrote the book because I couldn't not write it. I had seen too much over the years. I have been, like you said, helping kids, adolescents, and young adults who have distress over being male or female, as well as their parents. And John, I just saw too much to be able to sit on it and not do anything. I have seen how this belief system, this ideology that has no basis in medicine and no basis in science, I have seen how it shatters lives, the lives of young people, the lives of their parents' marriages sometimes end. And it's an incredibly destructive force. And so I had to speak up about it. There are terrible wrongs that are being done. There are atrocities that are being performed in the offices of doctors and hospitals. It is flat out wrong and without evidence of long-term benefit. So it's like a religion. It's like a tyrannical religion, actually, because we're not supposed to speak up against it. But more importantly is that the kids are expected to go along with the narrative at school. And this is a terribly difficult thing, a demand to make on these kids to accept the unreality of their friends' new identities and to be forced into using new names and new pronouns and all the rest of it, and for the girls to have boys in their bathrooms and in their changing rooms. So this has wide-reaching effects on kids, on parents, on families, and on society. And I saw too much to not write this book. Now, the point of the book is to educate parents. You don't need a PhD to read this book. It's for regular moms and dads. It's for regular families and parents who want to inoculate their kids against these dangerous ideas. It is a dangerous idea for a child to believe that their sex was randomly assigned when they were born. It's a dangerous idea to lead the child to believe that their biology can be denied without paying a price, and sometimes a very steep price. It's wrong to tell children that adults who want to be cautious and careful and ask a lot of questions before accepting any of this are bad people, are transphobic and bigoted, and that perhaps, the children are told, if you live in a home like that, where your parents are not accepting your identity automatically in a knee-jerk way, if your parents are not celebrating it and supporting you in your gender journey, well, maybe that's a toxic home that you need to get out of. And P.S., we can help you get out of your home. So when I say that I've seen a lot, I'm including families that I've talked to that I describe in my book that actually lost their kids because Child Protective Services came in and considered parents to be emotionally abusive, quote unquote, and medically neglectful, quote unquote, for not putting their child on this path toward medical treatments and surgical intervention. They have actually lost their children. So I had to write the book, and it is a very practical guide for every family. You don't wait until this is happening, until this bombshell, this nuclear bomb has exploded at your kitchen table. That's already late when that happens. I mean, I give advice to those parents as well, but primarily I want parents to be aware of what all of this is about, to be well informed, to understand it, to know what's happening in schools, in the medical field, in the legal field, in courts, before any of it actually happens. Did I use up all my time?
Well, that was great. You did, and you did it well. Can I ask just a couple follow-up questions quickly before we bring
Sure.
Dr. Grcevich on? First of all, so many of your chapters of the book highlight a dangerous idea. One of our, things that we say over and over and over at the Colson Center, quoting the famous line, "Ideas have consequences." We add to it, "Bad ideas have victims." And we could say dangerous ideas. You talk about John Money's dangerous ideas, psychiatry's dangerous ideas. You mentioned sex is assigned at birth. That's a dangerous idea. That parents are potentially enemies of their children.
Yes.
That's a dangerous idea. Is there one or two that you could just say in a nutshell also that you cover in the book, the dangerous ideas? Like, for example, John Money, what's his dangerous idea?
John Money's dangerous idea was that we have something called a psychological sex in addition to our biological sex, and that the psychological sex overrides the biology. That's a dangerous idea. Don't try to override your biology. You're going to run into trouble.
No, that's good. And there's so many more. And I appreciated what you said, that parents have to know this, because even if a child is not fully convinced that they themselves have been born into the wrong body or believing this, they could be imbibing on any one of these dangerous ideas that you have brought you brought out into the open in your book. And so many, we hear from grandparents, whose children bought into those ideas, and now it's affecting their grandchildren that way.
Yeah.
Do you see that a lot as well?
Yes. There are many victims here. It's not only the child, and this is something that I really brought out. I had a podcast with Dr. Jordan Peterson. I think it's been watched by like 3 million people, in which I focused on the trauma to parents. The parents, grandparents, and siblings go through horrific trauma when this happens. And my profession, the mental health profession, instead of being there for the parents and helping them with the trauma, instead they demonize them and they tell parents, you are the problem if you don't accept your child's identity. You're the problem. You're going to make your child suicidal.
Yeah. Well, last question, and we'll bring on Dr. Grcevich. I mentioned earlier that I have sensed a difference between the start of 2023 and the start of 2024, that more people are paying attention. By no means is this over. No one's saying that. Do you see any kind of bright spots? Are you encouraged by parents paying more attention? What are you seeing?
I'm very encouraged, John. Number one, the pushback is finally being heard, and the other side is having to acknowledge it. Because for many years, I mean, I wrote about this back in 2009, and I warned parents.
Wow.
And the left, the proponents of gender ideology, they just ignored. That's what they do. They ignore it. They can no longer ignore us. There's too many of us. There are detransitioners that are speaking out. and they're talking about their regret and their anger about what happened to them, and they are suing. So we now have a number of law firms in this country that are specializing in taking the cases of young people who were convinced that living as the opposite sex was going to be the answer to their emotional problems. And then they wake up shortly afterwards and they realize in no way was it the answer. They still have their emotional problems, and now they have a list of physical problems as well, including perhaps they are sterile from the treatments.
We need to get into that in our the rest of our Q&A, but I want to bring in Dr. Grcevich. So hang tight with us, Dr. Grossman. We'll be back with you in just a second with more questions. Steve, I just want to say, first of all, thank you for joining us. Your perspective is so interesting because you have committed so much of your life in ministry just helping families who have children with disability, particularly this community of parents who have a child with autism. That, of course, rings close to our hearts at the Colson Center. One of our board members, Emily Colson, that last name rings a bell because that's Chuck Colson's daughter. And Chuck Colson had a wonderful relationship with his grandson, Max, Emily's son, who has autism. And so when Emily pointed you or us in your direction, it had to do with some of the things here that Dr. Grossman was just talking about, that more and more things are coming to the surface. And one of those things that parents need to know about are the comorbidities, that this gender dysphoria that seems contagious, and we'll get to that point too, I'm sure, you're seeing a whole host of mental illness coming around, and a particularly high contagion in the autistic community. And so walk us through this. What are you seeing on the comorbidities, and why did you kind of jump into this area? I'm sure it wasn't just to make more friends, to jump into this area of speaking on these issues when you had this, ministry to families with disability.
Well, first off, I'd like to thank you, John, and thank the rest of your crew from Breakpoint for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'd also share that I'm honored to be sharing the same platform with Dr. Grossman, and she has spoken out very boldly about the issues that we're talking about tonight. And quite frankly, she's demonstrated a level of courage and integrity that's all too rare nowadays in our profession. And so, as you said, I wear a lot of different hats. So I'm a child adolescent psychiatrist in my 33rd year of clinical practice. I am an associate professor at the med school where I attended. And one of my responsibilities is that I am the only psychiatrist who helps out in teaching the evidence-based medicine thread in our school's curriculum. And, for most of my career, I loved being a doctor. But the positions that the medical community and our professional societies have taken with regard to treating kids with gender dysphoria is a major source of the anger and the shame and the embarrassment that I've experienced over the direction of my profession the last few years. I mean, the embrace of the gender revolution by the medical establishment and our academic institutions is the ultimate gaslighting. If they, with the support of the media and our overlords who run the internet, can convince the public that a person with male genitalia and a Y chromosome in every cell in their body is a female, there's no end to the lies that our culture shapers will be able to propagate. And so, as you touched on, I also serve as a president of Key Ministry, and we're a Christian organization. And we provide training, consultation, and resources to churches seeking to welcome families in their communities who are impacted by disability. And on an annual basis, we put together the largest disability ministry conference in North America. And part of, I think, how I got connected with you was that I gave a talk at our conference last year that Emily was able to watch, and specifically, said some things that I think resonated with a lot of people. And so the talk that I was giving was kind of rooted in this, embarrassment and shame about the medical profession. We're talking about different trends in medicine that were likely to impact the disability community in the next few years. And while I got a standing ovation at the end of the talk. We got more criticism of this talk than pretty much everything else that we had on the program combined. And the big question that came up is, why are we talking about gender dysphoria at a disability ministry conference? It turns out that, as we start to look at some of the data here, that the disability community has been disproportionately impacted by the gender revolution. It's an issue with kids, it's an issue with adults. And so what I thought I would do with our time tonight, or my time tonight, is take a look at some of the data, looking at the relationship between gender dysphoria, mental health, and different developmental disabilities. And so if you want to pull up the first slide, this is, believe it or not, from the Human Rights Campaign. And this was research that they had done based upon one of the large studies the federal government does looking at chronic health issues. And one of the things I think folks are surprised by is that it turns out across the board, and this is in adults, with basically every category of disability, the transgender adults are overrepresented, that they're more than twice as likely than the non-LGBTQ population to have any disability. But again, even compared to the LGBTQ population, they're significantly more likely to have cognitive disabilities. They're more likely to experience hearing loss. They're significantly more likely to need, assistance, in terms of independent living. They have significantly more mobility issues. They're 2 to 3 times as likely as the general population to need assistance with self-care. And interestingly enough, they're more likely to have visual disturbances than other folks in the LGBTQ population, or in the general population. Now, a second study I want to look at, if you want to pull up the next slide, is that this was a study, this is out of the UK, and it involved survey information on a population of about 250,000 adults. And what they're looking at here also gets to the mental health piece of it, where they're looking at the prevalence of different neurodevelopmental conditions in transgender adults. And so when they were looking at this issue in adults, they found that adults with autism were more than 5 times as likely to be transgenders, folks in the general population. Adults who are identified as transgender were 6 to 7 times more likely to have ADHD, roughly 4 times as likely to have depression, more than 5 times as likely to have bipolar disorder. They were more than 3 times as likely to have had a specific learning disorder or disability. They're more than 5 times as likely to have obsessive compulsive disorder. And interestingly enough, because this is a disorder that cuts directly to reality testing, they were over 28 times as likely as folks in the general population to have had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, when I started seeing a surge of kids coming through our practice who were wrestling with some of these issues, in a way of trying to get some insight as to how I might help them, by considering, I thought about considering comorbid mental health conditions, maybe even to get some insights in terms of why these particular kids seem to be vulnerable to this ideology. And I found that a lot of them would cling to this newly discovered identity with a rigidity and an inflexibility, not unlike that I see with my kids on the autism spectrum. That they would have qualities of, rumination and perseveration on this, like my kids with obsessive compulsive disorder. The same kind of delusional quality that I've seen in kids who come in with body dysmorphic disorder, and the disconnect from reality that we see in young people who are beginning to develop some sort of psychotic disorder. And so we'll see very similar data in kids when it comes to the severity and the complexity of the mental health issues that these folks are wrestling with. And so if we want to look at this next slide, this is data that came from a study where they were looking at ways of supporting the mental health needs of kids who identify as transgender in school. And in the population that they were serving, And this is a broad population covering, I think, roughly around 1,200 kids who identified as transgender. Nearly 70% of them had clinical significant anxiety disorder. Nearly 60% had clinical depression. More than half reported chronic non-suicidal self-injury. Oftentimes, cutting themselves is probably the most common way that would manifest. And I think that the most shocking statistic was that nearly half of them met screening criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, if we want to take a look at the next study, this is looking at, this is looking specifically at the impact of adverse childhood experiences on the mental health of transgender youth. And recently, because he's going to be speaking at the conference that we're going to be putting on in May, one of our prospective speakers had been a children and youth pastor who was serving and providing support to about 4,000 churches in his denomination. And interestingly enough, part of how he got invested in looking specifically at this gender issue was that this was the second most common reason why youth pastors had been reaching out to him looking for help. And to take it a step further, he began doing formal training on this subject because another large nonprofit organization that focuses specifically on supporting families involved with adoption and foster care were begging for training because they're being disproportionately impacted by this too. And so this particular study that we're taking a look at that compared to LGBTQ youth, that transgender kids who were surveyed were more likely to have experienced a wide variety of adverse childhood experiences, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, compared to, again, the LGBTQ population. And that based upon adverse childhood experiences alone, they could explain away almost 20% of the variance that you see in the presence of mental health diagnoses and conditions between transgender youth and youth who identify as LGBTQ. So from an evidence-based medicine perspective, one of the things that's a problem, and Dr. Grossman touched on this, is that a lot of the studies that are out there and some of the things that are being published very recently are characterized by very small sample sizes, very short duration of follow-up. And so in looking at this topic, I found large population studies from countries where all their health information is collected into a single database to be really valuable, because these kinds of studies are less likely to be manipulated or biased by the processes through which the study subjects are recruited and selected. And so here in the US, one large population data set that's available to researchers involves a system, or comes from the system, that pays for health care for members of the military and their families. So this next study looked at mental health treatment information for all military dependents who had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria between the years 2010 and 2018. And so that there were roughly 3,700 kids who with gender dysphoria where they had data from this study. And so that they basically had two control groups. There was one control group was the siblings of the kids who had been identified with gender dysphoria. The other control group, ultimately ended up being kids who had a gender dysphoria diagnosis who didn't, quote unquote, undergo gender affirming care, i.e., puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones. And so, looking at this very large military database, that we know that the transgender youth, consistent with the data we talked about before, were over 5 times more likely to carry mental health diagnoses in addition to gender dysphoria. that we found, like, when you compare them to their siblings, they use significantly more mental health services and about 2.5 times as many prescriptions for psychiatric medication relative to their siblings. Now, I thought the most stunning finding out of this study was that when they looked at psychotropic medication use, the medication use increased 67% after these kids began either the puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones compared to what they were taking before they went through the quote-unquote gender-affirming care. And in terms of specific classes of medicine, they were more likely to get serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, one of which is an approved treatment in kids for anxiety, but none of which have been FDA approved for depression. They're more likely to get sleep medicine, antipsychotics, lithium, and overall had pronounced increases in the use of psychotropics. And so with the families I served, and John, you touched on this in part of the introduction, a really hot topic is the connection between gender-affirming care and autism in youth. And coming back to these large databases, one of the things that they have available in Europe, where they have socialized medicine, not that I'm a fan of that, but one of the things that they're available to do is to develop very large databases to look at these issues. And so in the UK specifically, until very recently, every family that sought gender-affirming care was referred to a clinic called the Tavistock Center. And this is a clinic in suburban London that was run by the British Health Service. And about a year or two ago, the clinic was shut down after an independent review that had been commissioned by the British government and led by a woman, Dr. Hilary Cass, who was a highly respected academic pediatrician. One of the things that they found when they were doing their investigation was that 35% of the kids who had received puberty blockers or hormones through the clinic met criteria for at least moderate to severe autism. And so at the time that these kids were treated, the prevalence of autism in the UK at that point in time in the pediatric population was 2.1%. So the kids on the spectrum were 17 times more likely than their peers to receive medical treatment for gender transitioning. And this is a major concern to the families that I serve in my practice. I mean, I've had parents of kids on the high end of the spectrum, like kids who are introverted, socially awkward, tell me that they're scared to death to take their kids to see a psychologist or a counselor out of the fear that their child will be encouraged to consider gender dysphoria as a source of their distress. And my practice is really unusual in that I do house calls, and about 30% of all of my appointments take place in my patients' homes. And last year, I found myself at the kitchen table with a family that I'd known for a long time. Their teenage son on the high end of the autism spectrum had struggled for a long time with social isolation, social anxiety. Mom and dad were thrilled when he moved up to high school and found a peer group after he got to high school. Except that every kid in his new circle of friends was a girl who believed that they were a boy. And the conversation at the lunch table centered around how they could persuade their parents to take them to the gender clinic at the local children's hospital. And as I sat there talking to this kid with his family in the kitchen, I mean, the fear on his mother's face, while I was talking to her son and she was witnessing just how resolute he was in his belief that he's really a girl, is something that I'm going to have a hard time forgetting, and is very consistent with what Dr. Grossman talked about with the trauma that the parents go through. I think the most important point, though, in all of these findings is that the risk of being lost, given the way that this is becoming politicized in America, is that the kids who are wrestling with this stuff are extraordinarily fragile and vulnerable. And they and their families desperately need, our care and our support. I think it's important that we reserve our scorn for the institutions that deserve it. Hospitals and clinics that profit from this stuff and direct kids and families down this road without sufficiently thorough evaluation, and while minimizing in what they quote unquote call informed consent the potential long-term risks of treatment with kids who, from a developmental standpoint, aren't capable of providing truly informed consent. The professional societies that are shutting down debate about the appropriateness of these treatments at the same time that a number of nations in Europe are slamming the brakes on quote unquote gender affirming care, is, utterly inappropriate. And I think it's, undermining the credibility of our profession. The politicians who seek to undermine parents in terms of determining the most appropriate care for our child, they deserve our scorn. And so just to wrap this up, since, again, that this presentation is being hosted by a prominent Christian organization, I want to share a few thoughts for folks who are pastors, church leaders, volunteers who minister with, and interact with youth who are impacted by this issue. And so part of my job description, as a Christian, is to witness to the truth and care for the vulnerable. Kids with autism or kids who feel this discomfort in their own bodies and latch onto gender as an explanation, where they go to these clinics where their parents are emotionally blackmailed into consenting to these unproven treatments, they're vulnerable. And that our churches need to be places where kids and teens who are, wrestling with, gender dysphoria and other issues around identity need to be able to experience a place where they can belong. And that even in situations where parents are doing what they're told to do by their medical and mental health professionals, we still need to be welcoming these kids. We can't lose sight of the fact that from a Christian perspective, their greatest need, their family's greatest need, is a relationship with Jesus. And we know that based upon the research examining the relationship between childhood disability and families with family church attendance, the families who have kids with all of these mental health conditions that we described are far less likely than their friends and neighbors to ever set foot in a church. And it would be really great if these kids could get the belonging, at their local church that they seem to be finding in these online forums, and online groups that are devoted to this stuff. Being kind to these kids and their families is absolutely essential. That I can't imagine anything more damaging to an adolescent's spiritual development, particularly adolescents on the autism spectrum, than experiencing cruelty or bullying from kids or adults who identify with church. From what we know out of mental health ministry, it would be important, if they're coming to church, to not make their gender-related issues a focus of attention at church. The kids, when they have mental health concerns in their families, what they most want, and as we talked about, most of them have very substantial mental health concerns. What they want is that they want to be able to come to church and blend in with everybody else. And so one obvious flashpoint would be bathroom use. And if your church doesn't have a fully accessible family restroom, this might be a good time to think about building one. Parents are a great resource and may have very helpful insights for engaging with and responding to their kids. And finally, leaders within an individual church are going to want to be proactive in thinking about, how they might minister with kids and adults with gender dysphoria and their families in a way that's consistent with their biblical witness, and identify non-negotiables up front. And so that for me, when you look at these hot button issues, if I have a kid in my office, I'll call that child by whatever name their parents want me to call them, since naming a child is a parent's prerogative. But I'm not going to use pronouns that diverge from biological reality, in part because part of my job description as a child psychiatrist is to promote and reinforce healthy reality testing in my patients, and supporting thoughts that clash with objective biological reality, is incompatible with that. But the key point is that for those in ministry, that these kids and their families need the church, and we need them because they have gifts and talents, that are intended for the larger body. And so at this point, I will go ahead and stop and turn it back to John for questions and conversation.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Grcevich. I appreciate that. We're going to bring on again, Dr. Grossman. As you might expect, the questions are absolutely pouring in. And I want to start with the first question here. Before we do, I'm going to try to gather and give the audience a little bit of time to throw some more questions in the mix. We have a quick video of a brand new resource that we want folks to know about. It's called the Identity Project. We worked with 30 or so other organizations to launch this. And so as you continue to type your questions in, take a look at this resource that you can take advantage of, just launching today.
We need to stand on solid ground, to stand on the truth.
We want to be grounded in, again, we are made in the image of God, and we go back to that.
Freedom is not rejecting restraint, but embracing the right restraints about the world we live in and the bodies that God has given us.
I also love that we're talking about being created male and female, and we're not even talking about sexual love yet. Exactly. But we have to start here.
They're being taught this everywhere. They're being taught about gender all the time, except in the church.
And we need to get back to biblical standards and convictional Christianity when it comes to sexual purity, not cultural Christianity.
Before we tell them how to behave, we need to help them understand who they are.
We'll need a theology of the body that goes beyond these topics and actually helps us recover a more comprehensive sense of what it means to be embodied.
Our culture tells us that our gender reflects ourselves, but the Bible tells us that our gender reflects our Creator.
You can change your attitudes and you can change your beliefs. You don't have to change your gender.
So-called gender transition surgery. What happens to children like that 20 or 30 years from now? We simply don't know.
I struggled with my own transgender identity. But the longer that you go down this road, the more you are desperate for this to be real.
This has been part of my own story, wrestling with same-sex attraction at various points.
Society at the moment is living out what Scripture says will happen.
Many of my colleagues in child psychiatry share my concerns about this. They're afraid to speak out.
The real question is, what do we do with that? How do parents contend with this?
When it comes to children and talking about sex, questions can feel embarrassing or uncomfortable, but as parents, we want to meet them in those places.
It takes many years for parents to teach the kids right and wrong.
The best way to protect children from deception is to teach them the truth.
Sex is objectified, made to just be about bodies, but we know God created it to be so much more.
Everybody has some baggage with regards to sexual sin.
Another thing we have to do better is effectively prepare people for marriage.
Marriage, as God designed it, was perfect. One man, one woman for life.
If marriage civilizes men, then we've never lived at a time in our history where there's more uncivilized men walking the streets of our communities.
What I'm suggesting is that we do this more thoughtfully, more intentionally.
I'm feeling a lot more optimistic, Maria, because things are starting to change.
We can do this better. We can do this better, even today.
Well, there you go. That's called the Identity Project, just launching today. And we're really excited about this basically one-stop shop for resources on sex, marriage, gender, male and female, image of God, theology of the body, all from a Christian worldview. Well, Dr. Grossman, I want to start by funneling the questions to you. And there's been a number of questions asking about the balance here. How many boys are questioning their identity versus girls? And I know one of the things that we've seen is this explosion of young girls, at least that's the perception, who are really being taken in by gender ideology. Is that true? Has there been an explosion of this uniquely affecting young girls? And can you speak to any of the causes maybe behind that?
Well, a few decades ago, before the tsunami of cases, we were well aware that there were extremely rare instances of kids who from an early age felt uncomfortable with being a boy or a girl. And this was called gender identity disorder. And yes, for every girl that would fit that diagnosis, there were 6 or 7 boys. So at that time, we had a lot more boys than girls. And that has switched. Right now, in the past 8 or 10 years, we have a 5,000% increase of kids who are announcing that their identity is not what their bodies are. And yes, there is a majority of girls, but it's certainly not, that's not to say there aren't plenty of boys as well who are suffering from this. So, I mean, in my practice, I would say that I've had about 50%, 50-50.
Okay.
But in other research, it shows that there's probably more like 60-65% of girls that are suffering from what we now call gender dysphoria.
Can either of you speak to the causes? Are they unique for boys versus girls?
Well, yeah, they are getting into it through somewhat different pathways. There is an element here, a very important element of social contagion. Social contagion is when feelings or beliefs or behaviors spread among a friend group. And that friend group can be in real life or online. And we know that girls, teenage girls, are especially susceptible to social contagion. We saw it with eating disorders. We saw it with suicidal behaviors. And now we're seeing it with gender dysphoria. So girls are particularly vulnerable to this. And I've seen in my practice where a girl has told me, for example, you know, I was never unhappy about my hips. I was okay with my hips, but my friend started ranting and raving about how much she hates her hips. And you know what? I'm starting to hate my hips now as well.
Wow.
And so that is called a social contagion.
Yeah. Dr. Grcevich, I want to quickly bring up a question that I think some people just kind of were shocked at the numbers. First of all, your slides are going to be available. The video of this is going to be available on YouTube tomorrow. And are you willing for us to share the slides as well? Then,
absolutely.
That because some of those, the numbers of comorbidities here. Do you? Schizophrenia was 28 times. Did I see that right? That was what a remarkable.
That was in an adult sample, yeah.
So one of the questions that has come up is: Are these slides implying that struggling with gender dysphoria is a cause of these other psychological issues? These other psychological issues are a cause of transgender, and what's the causation correlation here? What are you pointing out?
So first off, one of the things about this population compared to the LGBTQ population is that some of the mental health struggles they seem to have are like exponentially worse. So that when you're looking, for example, like at rates of like suicidal behavior 3 times in LGBTQ kids, what you see in the general population. I've seen reports it's 15 to 20 times, is common in kids who identify as transgender. So that, for those who think about, sexual minority youth being, marginalized, and experiencing mental health struggles related to that. I mean, this, it's exponentially different in terms of the complexity of like some of the mental health issues that you see. And Dr. Grossman can probably speak into this from her experience with her practice. But with mine, that these were kids that we were treating for years, for their ADHD, their anxiety, they're on the high end of the spectrum. That they may have had other issues, and this came up, way down the road. And so that she touched on this issue that what we used to, traditionally think of as kids with gender identity disorder, I think I saw one of those. One kid who had that in 25 years, up to, Caitlyn Jenner coming out. But this group that's presenting now is different than the group that was described pre-2015. That there's this rapid onset gender dysphoria phenomena, where with a lot of conditions, part of how we think about this is that there should be that there's a continuum of these feelings or these perceptions that go back into early childhood. What I think is really different about this group of kids that we're seeing now is that, when you talk to their parents, when they were 6, 8, 10, 12 years old, that there was, never any evidence of gender dysphoria, that typically, that these kids would be, engaged in the typical kinds of behaviors that were appropriate for a child of their age and sex. And so it's the rapid onset of this, the development of it, at a later age. And one of the things that I would question, tied into like what Dr. Grossman said, is, do certain of these conditions predispose kids to more vulnerability to social contagion?
Yeah.
Again, that the evidence-based medicine professor, I don't have a study that I can quote to you to prove it. Maybe Dr. Grossman does. But it seems to me that when I think about the kids who came through our practice, they tend to be very bright, socially awkward, introverted. A high percentage of them are on the high end of the spectrum. And that there are other kids who are predisposed to obsess and ruminate about things, so that when something is suggested to them compared to their peers, they have a harder time letting go of the idea.
Is that something? Does that sound familiar to you, Dr. Grossman, and what you're seeing in your practice as well?
I'm so sorry. I was just looking at the excellent questions in the chat. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. That's all right. Let me then go to the evidence-based. There's a number of questions about the evidence-based medicine. Why do you think so many in your profession have gone away from evidence-based? And what kind of professional price have you paid, Dr. Grossman, for kind of standing out and stepping and speaking out this way?
Okay, it's not individual psychiatrists, psychologists, and doctors who have gone away from evidence-based medicine. It is the professional organizations such as the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Association of Pediatrics. Those organizations have been captured by small but very vocal and aggressive activists. And those activists are in control of certain key committees, and they have foisted their agenda, their ideological agenda, on the rest of us. And what's important for parents to know when they go to their pediatrician, or they go to they're talking to the school guidance counselor or their therapist, they have to understand that these people in general are just going to follow the advice given to them by their organization. And it makes me very sad, but it is true to say that these organizations can no longer be trusted. So that's what we have to be aware of, that the organizations themselves have been captured by the ideology. Now, I see all these excellent questions that are coming up, and I want to tell people, I hope you don't mind, that if I have a ton of resources on my website that where people can find answers to a lot of these issues that they're asking about. I have things that I've written. I have a list of resources for parents of all sorts of websites and organizations that can be helpful to them, and to grandparents, obviously, as well. I see grandparents are writing in. So my website is miriamgrossmanmd.com. And because I know, we're not going to be able to address all of these points.
Well, and that brings up one of the things that I meant to say earlier, and it's just we got so many questions that were, I think, appropriate. But there is something that both Dr. Grossman and Dr. Grcevich mentioned offline here before we began, which is as professional psychiatrists, they're not able here to give specific medical advice on specific conditions. And so I'm trying to kind of generalize some of the questions and so on. But what's hard is that we're talking about the trend lines. We're talking about how things have changed quickly. We're talking about the social contagion aspect and the cracks in the system. And yet there's, like you said, Dr. Grossman, there's parents on here. There's grandparents on here. Is there anything either one of you can suggest? Let's say, you're dealing with, a teenager who has already kind of gone down that line and is obsessed kind of mentally, maybe deceived, maybe has embraced an identity contrary to their body. I think a lot of parents feel helpless because so many people are saying to their child, your parents are the bad guys here, or your grandparents are the bad guys here. What can you say to them?
Many, many parents feel terribly isolated. And I want them to know, and grandparents as well, that there are so many like you out there, and you need to connect with them. There are many, many support groups of parents, grandparents, siblings, including parents of adult children. I saw that there were a few questions about how to handle, your adult children who, may be identifying as something other than their biology, how to handle that, what to do about the pronouns. You don't have to face this by yourself. Please join one of the groups. Begin reading. There's again, my website has tons of stuff that will direct you to websites and groups where you will no longer feel alone. You are not alone. Parents who are representing reality and parents who are loving and devoted, but will not go will not cross the line over to endorsing their child's delusion. There are many of you, thousands, if not tens of thousands, all over the world. It's just that you don't know about one another. I did a survey for my book of parents who have transgender identifying children. And I asked them a bunch of questions regarding what advice would you give other families that have yet to go through this crisis. And I got responses from 500 parents from 17 different countries.
Wow.
Okay. And there's fabulous advice there. Advice about schools, advice about the internet, how to handle this at home, how to talk to your child in a loving and supportive way without endorsing the unreality. So my first advice to parents is don't stay alone in this. You can get life-saving, and it really might be life-saving, because I see parents who are suffering so intensely over this that they're actually suicidal.
Yeah.
And you need to please hook up with those other parents and grandparents.
I don't want to be simplistic, but how important is it to unplug the cell phone?
Oh, yeah. Well, let's say the internet, not as much the internet. You must be vigilant and get control of your child. If your child is living at home, their internet use, because we spoke about the social contagion, and it is just, running wild online on all the different, chat rooms and Reddit and Discord and, YouTube and many, many other places. I have an appendix in the book written by an IT specialist who will take you through step by step what your options are, for getting control of your child's internet. It's not negotiable. You must do it.
Dr. Grcevich, this is, I think, a good question. It actually came to my mind as you were talking. The question is more general. Isn't it true? We hear this a lot, that if left on their own, children who are questioning their gender identity will desist and identify with their biological sex by the end of puberty. And we've seen numbers of 80% and so on. Is that true? And is it different? Here's the question that I'm going to add to this question. Is it different for children who are somewhere on the autism spectrum? Are those numbers consistent, or is it different for those children?
Okay, so the 80 to 90% numbers come out of a clinic in Toronto. A guy, Ken Zucker, was probably sort of the top expert in the world in terms of treating these kids. And he was the guy, in fact, who was, the author of the chapter on this in the DSM-5. And what I think he was describing were these kids that Dr. Grossman touched on earlier, where, that they're coming in, from a very young age, maybe, with interests and activities and behaviors that would be more characteristic of the opposite sex. It was true that the majority of boys who were that way, that they followed to adulthood, that they desisted from, their gender discordance or their gender dysphoria, but the majority of them became gay. Girls were kind of a mixed bag, like when they looked at that longitudinally. But I'm not sure that the kids that we're describing now, and a lot of the kids that, Dr. Grossman is seeing in her practice, our busiest therapist, when I still had a group practice, the majority of her caseload were kids who were struggling, with this by the time she went off and started her own place. And so that I do think that these kids who are, the quote unquote rapid onset gender dysphoria, there's a different phenomena going on here. And, I think that we can hypothesize that, again, social contagion, fueled by, the internet, where, kids have an opportunity, to hear about these, to hear about these ideas and engage with other people who are holding themselves out, as having an answer to their discomfort's a big piece of it. I don't think that we know enough about this, all these kids that have surged in the last 5 years to be able to say with great certainty how it's going to turn out.
Mm-hmm. Got anything you want to address on that, Dr. Grossman?
Well, I would agree. We don't know how these kids are going to turn out because it's a new population. It's a new demographic. Unfortunately, many of them are being quickly put on an assembly line that leads to puberty blockers and estrogen, testosterone, and surgery. And so we're not giving them the opportunity to grow up, and we're not giving them an opportunity for their brains to mature. And we know that it takes until the mid-20s for the part of the brain that is responsible for a careful, rational think, like the CEO of the brain, that considers the pluses and minuses of every decision, considers the consequences, takes time to kind of weigh things back and forth. That part of the brain is not fully developed until a person is about 25. And, here we are letting 11-year-olds say, well, I don't want to go through puberty. I don't care if I can't have biological children. This is what's going to make me happy right now. And the doctors are doing it. And the parents are signing on the dotted line because they're trusting the doctors and they don't want to lose their child.
I want to hit that real quick, to lose the child. How prevalent is the suicide threat in these medical situations?
Okay. Well, what we're being led to believe, and especially parents are constantly being asked, would you rather have a dead daughter or a live son? Mm-hmm. Meaning the mantra is transition or die, transition or suicide, which is the most frightening thing that any parent can hear. Now, the truth is that these kids have an elevated risk of suicidal behaviors and completed suicide, but only when you compare them to kids that don't have any mental health issues. When you compare them to other kids with autism, depression, anxiety, ADHD, et cetera, then it's pretty much the same. It is pretty much the same rate of suicide. Of course, every suicide, John, is a terrible, terrible tragedy. But the truth is, we're not looking at these wildly crazy, elevated figures. The people, honestly, who have the highest risk of suicide is white middle-class men. They commit suicide more often than any other group.
Yeah. What about the post affirmation care? Does that suicide risk go away? Does it persist after? Let's say if you go the complete affirming route, because that's really the threat, right? Do you want a dead daughter or a living son? So you're basically being told, affirm them. That's the answer if they are suicidal. Is that true?
We don't have good evidence that all these medical interventions prevent suicides in the long run. And part of the issue here in terms of research is that there's a huge dropout rate. So even if we had, let's say, 300 people that 20 years ago went through gender, quote unquote, affirming care, if you then follow up on them, and half are lost to follow up, you can't find them. They're not answering, your emails or your phone calls. The conclusions, that you can reach with just half the people responding are not going to be completely valid conclusions because you've lost half of your population. Now, why would it be that there's such a large dropout rate in these studies? Why is it that people are not returning the questionnaires from the clinics or the phone calls from the clinics? Well, it likely is because they're not doing so well. And they don't want to speak to the clinic that gave them these treatments. It's much more likely that that's the reason they're not responding than that they're not responding because they're insanely happy with their new status and with their new, appearance. Those people would be much more likely to respond. Yeah, I'm doing great. I have a lifelong partner. I have my identity is stable. I'm not having any big medical problems. I'm extremely happy. But it's people who do not respond to the follow-up who are probably not doing well.
John, if I can just follow up on that for a second, where we do have long-term data, as you look at these European countries, and Sweden has 30 years worth of data on this. And when they looked at folks who actually underwent gender reassignment surgery, their suicide rate was no different. And I believe it was like 18 times, the baseline rate for the population, compared to folks who had gender dysphoria who didn't undergo the surgery. So in adults, there was, that maybe there were a few measures where they reported a better quality of life. But 30 years worth of data from a European country, there was no evidence that any of this stuff protected against suicide.
And I think I'm sorry, if I could just jump in for a minute, because it's really important. I don't want to minimize the suffering that people experience, people who have severe gender dysphoria. I cannot imagine waking up every morning and feeling like I'm in the wrong body. And I don't mean to minimize that. I also don't mean to dismiss the fact that, yes, there are individuals who are very happy with their gender reassignment, and they would never turn back and do it over again. The thing is that we have no way of predicting which people those are going to be in that category and which people are going to be filled with regret.
Wow, that's an interesting point. So I want to hit two. There's a couple set of questions here that have to do with some of this kind of narrative around that. The first has to do with children born at, let's say, ambiguous genitalia, intersex, the intersex condition. So oftentimes these, exceptions to, very clear, it's a boy, it's a girl when a child is born. These exceptions are used to justify kind of the wholesale gender ideology. So how can you help us think through, we had 3 or 4 of those questions having to do with an intersex condition or something like that. How do you think through that, or help us think through that as a reality?
Can I jump in there?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. What's important to understand is that even in those very rare individuals, which is 0.02% of births, in which the baby has some sort of chromosome or medical abnormality that causes them to have genitalia that do not look like your standard male or female genitalia, even those people fit into the category of male or female, and I'll explain why that is. Male or female means that your reproductive system is designed around the potential of producing either eggs or sperm. There is no third gamete. In other words, eggs and sperm are gametes, reproductive cells. Everybody, even people who are what we call intersex now, or we call it, differences of sexual development, they still have reproductive systems that are designed around either producing sperm or eggs. Now, they may not produce either of those, and they may be infertile, but they still are either male or female. So, there's a lot of confusion around this issue, and the proponents of gender ideology want us to believe that something like, 1 in 100 or some hugely inflated number of people are born with ambiguous, not male, not female. That is not the case. We are mammals. Mammals are either male or female.
Well, to follow up on that, it's interesting because I can remember one lecture from like my days as a resident back in the 1980s, and it was specifically on this topic. And I remember that the doctor was talking about it, said that it was important, that it was important up front to get it right and be consistent, because the worst thing you could ever do to a kid, is to confuse them about their gender identity.
Wow. And now it's, as we've already documented, and I'm just reading again through the questions, we've gotten so many, it's so hard. All of the even non-medical forces that are hoisting that idea on children. Here, we can't give specific legal advice, although I would love to hear, this is I would love to hear your thoughts if you've got any place to send this dad. The heartbreak of this, the parents are also victims. Here you have a custody case over a child. The father is $90,000 in debt, fighting over 3 years now. And while a mom is trying to take away his daughter and transition the daughter into a son. This is the real life situation a lot of people are in. This is one of the folks that are watching right now. May God help you. May God encourage your heart. May God lead you to the right people. I just want to stop and pray for you. Is there any legal groups that you all know of? I know obviously we're big advocates and partners with the Alliance Defending Freedom. They're dealing with this on a religious freedom and a parental rights. I don't know that they're doing custody issues between parents. Do either of you know a place where we might send somebody for sort of legal help. I will say, by the way, to this person, looking through Dr. Grossman's website, knowing about the book, the misinformation about this is so rampant, you can't even be sure that your attorneys are getting the information they need. So go to Dr. Grossman's website, go to the resource page, go to the video and article page, and send them there. But I know you can't give personal counseling advice. Do you know any legal groups that we might point this gentleman to?
Yeah,
I'm not aware of. Go ahead.
There's a group called Child and Parental Rights Campaign.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
And they're really fantastic. Those are the lawyers that wrote 2 appendices for me in my book. Bernadette Broyles and her team are fabulous. Now, they're mostly doing, I believe, the lawsuits against schools, but they may have an idea. I mean, first you need a lawyer who's going to be fully informed. The lawyer really, if that gentleman is still on, you and your lawyer need to read my book, because I'm giving you all the information that you need to stand up in front of a judge and fight this.
Yeah, that's right. You got to have the facts, and the facts are there, and they are intentionally hidden. And you've got to also have the facts about some of these fake studies. I'm glad you mentioned Bernadette Broyles. I've forgotten about her work. It's really spectacular. I think it's a her. Pretty sure it is. Yes. And just very, very, very important. Man, what a heartfelt question. If you're listening, would you just take a moment and pray for this dad? Pray that God gives him grace and strength. Gosh, there's nothing like a parent fighting for a child in that way. God bless him. Oh man. All right. Let me go over to another question. This is a specific case, but I think both of you in your professional capacities, we need more counselors in this area. I think a lot of Christian counselors that I talk to will just basically not address this issue because they know the particular state that they're in. They could be threatened with being, disbarred, or whatever the term is for psychologists or psychiatrists, professional counselors. And of course, there's plenty that, as you said, Dr. Grossman, just go along with the party line. So there's at least one question here from a young counselor wanting to get into this work. Can they legitimately be on the right side of this issue without putting their career in danger? And what do you say about that?
Let me go ahead and take this one. It's interesting you mentioned Alliance Defending Freedom, because they're working with a friend of mine. There's a guy, Alan Josephson, who was the chair of child psychiatry at University of Louisville, who gave a lecture about 6 years ago in DC, arguing for a more conservative approach using supportive therapy with these kids. Lost his job over that. One of the things I would suggest to them is, and I think Dr. Grossman touched on the issue that we have a problem at the specialty society level, but we also have a problem in that the vast preponderance of folks in our field now find themselves working for these large healthcare institutions, like back when I started off in practice, most people who did what Dr. Grossman and I did were in independent practice. Very few are now. And when you're on staff at a place that has one of these gender clinics, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to be an advocate for some of these things, and still keep your job. And so that one piece of advice that I would give to somebody thinking about doing this kind of work is that you need to create an environment, or you need to create a job situation where you are as unencumbered as possible to practice in a way that, in accordance with your conscience and in accordance with your understanding of best practices and evidence-based care. I also think that it's important, we were talking about the support needs of parents, that, if there are church people on here, it would be important for them, to vet counselors in their community that they can point people to. to vet pediatricians who will be able to give kids, evidence-based medical care. And that increasingly part of why I think it's my responsibility to speak out is that I'm an old guy. I mean, yeah, go ahead, take away my license. I'll be in full-time ministry the next morning. And thankful for not having to deal with pharmacy benefit managers anymore, or some of the other nonsense that we get into. But the folks who are starting off, where they're 30 years old, 35 years old, several $100,000 in debt, they have families to support. It's really, really hard for them. But I think that the degree possible, if you're a professional, get yourself into a situation where you can practice in accordance with your conscience. If you're a family looking for help, finding a practitioner who is independent and evidence-based in what they do, on the basis of, recommendations from trusted people and trusted professionals in your life, is something I would very much encourage folks to pursue if they're in a situation where they need this kind of care.
Yeah. Dr. Grossman, you have anything to add there in terms of professional advice to someone coming up, and then also to parents and trying to wade through these waters?
I get these emails all the time. I get emails that say, I was thinking of becoming a psychologist, but because of everything that's going on now, I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm going to become a computer programmer. It's people have to look deep into their souls and decide, how important it is for them to live their own truth. I think, I can't answer that for anybody. I'm aware that for a person who's just starting off and has a lot of debt, they're going to be worried about their job. But at some point, you have to do what's right. And it may be tough. It may be really tough, but in my opinion, the other road is a much worse one.
Yeah.
So I have absolutely no regrets in all the speaking out that I've done. And yes, I have had, I've paid a price, but I would never look back and do anything differently.
As a Christian, we bring into as well the concept of calling, and I think God doesn't always call you to do a job that won't have that sort of friction. He might actually be calling you to get fired, and we've often said we need a theology of getting fired. All right, we have 2 minutes left. I'm gonna get to 2 more questions, so we're all gonna have to be disciplined here. Okay. A bunch of questions going back to the suicidality, going back to the comorbidities. Does social acceptance, does increased social acceptance change this data? In other words, it's often said, well, the reason that there's all these, depression and there's, eating disorders and everything else associated with this and high suicide rates is because they're not accepted. If they were accepted on a social level, then it would be better. Quick answer to that, either one. Raise your hand. Who wants this one? Okay.
I think all this affirmation is making things worse, in that it's perpetuating confusion in our kids, and that it's creating for them a distorted reality, and it's making it more difficult for them to work through the traditional processes of identity development that have historically characterized adolescence.
All right, good. Hey,
right.
just one. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I would say that, you're kind of walking a tightrope. There are things that, you might want to permit your child to do in terms of clothing and haircut and, other things. They're not permanent. You may want to give a little bit on that. You may want to come up with a creative name that, is not exactly the name that your child would like, but it's also a little bit different. than their given name. So, you want to have some resilience, but overall, I agree. You're not doing a favor to your child to endorse something that's not true.
It's good.
That's not a favor. That's not a kindness.
Speaking of callings in this unique moment, the Christian Medical and Dental Society, we worked with them for a long time. I guess somebody from that organization's watching. They're looking for medical professionals that will help with detransitioners. I mean, that's something. Where does a Chloe Cole go to say, okay, well, how do I go through this again? How do I, find out who I am? And man, it could be a calling. And I think those numbers of detransitioners are going to go up. That's going to also be a social contagion, that when people that are trapped in a social contagion realize, oh, there's an exit strategy here. And man, what a wonderful redemptive calling that there is. So I wanted to mention that. Well, listen, we are out of time, and we're committed to close these forums out on time as much as possible. I just am so grateful for both of you for being so courageous and for stepping out here. And that really has made a difference. And I do look at the start of 2024 versus 2023, and I think, thank God there are people that are pointing to truth over and over and over and over. And that sometimes feels like it's not as direct an application if you're kind of in the middle of it and going through it as maybe as it could be. But man, we need truth in an age of lies. And I'm grateful for the work that all of you have done. I want to point everyone to Dr. Grossman's website, MiriamGrossmanMD.com, MiriamGrossmanMD.com. And of course, the book again is Lost in Transnation. And Dr. Grcevich, where can people follow your work?
Okay. Our ministry, it's www.keyministry.org. The national conference this year is Disability in the Church. It will be May 1st through the 3rd at Calvary, Orlando. And we will be having a special town meeting on the Thursday of the conference, specifically on the interface of gender, sexuality, and disability.
And is that available live stream or anything like that if people aren't there in person, or do you got to be in person to get it?
That particular part of the program, I believe folks need to attend in person.
Okay, you got it. Thank you both so much for contributing tonight. I wish we could get to all these questions. We'll try to look through them and provide as many answers in some setting as we can. So please stay tuned for that. Now, just to close out our time, in addition to saying thank you, I do want to, again, let people know about this brand new resource that the Colson Center has joined with 30 other partners to produce. All the best information that you can find in video format and teaching on sex, gender, identity, family, marriage, society, pornography abuse. I mean, you think about all the different issues surrounding the question of identity. And this is just really the most comprehensive resource that I know of. It's called the Identity Project. And we're going to close our time with one more video that will fill you in on how you can sign up and become a subscriber to the Identity Project. Dr. Grossman, Dr. Grcevich, thank you so much.
Thank you.